I'm now 66, and I encountered the passage I'm going to be talking about 44 years ago when I was 22 years old. And it changed the trajectory of my life, and it still informs my life, I would say, on a daily basis, because it had that kind of impact on me. When I was 22, I was looking for meaning in life. I always remember amongst my college friends, I was always the one asking the philosophical questions. Probably not surprising I would become a pastor because, I was asked, they'd say, you're the philosopher in the group. And, asking big questions about the meaning of life and so on. But I wasn't exactly at 22 a typical candidate for Christian conversion. I was living the life, that every 22-year-old kind of thinks they want to live. But when I heard the message from a friend of mine about the real Jesus at 22, I knew I was at a crossroad. I knew I guess I'd been ignorant up to that point. I thought religion was just going to church and kind of doing a few things and not doing a few other things. And so when I heard the message of Jesus, I realized I was at this crossroad. I either had to accept this message and accept him into my life, and my life would completely change, or at that point I would reject that message and say, I can no longer kind of pretend like I'm a Christian. I have to acknowledge that I'm a secular person and I'm doing my journey alone. So I knew I was at that kind of a crossroad in my life, and I, of course, chose to follow him, and the rest of my life is, that story. But because of the Christian culture I was in, and, we all have a Christian culture, right? Western Pennsylvania has a bit of a Christian culture. The South has a Christian culture. South Florida has one, even kind of subcultures of the different cultures down there. But I met the Lord in Central Florida. I was living in Winter Park, Florida. And if you're in Florida, a lot of the churches are Southern Baptist churches. How many of you have ever gone to a Southern Baptist church? Okay, so, quite a number of you. You know what that's like. There's a lot of strengths and there's some, oddities to it. But one of the things that, know that it's odd, but if you become a Christian down there, the first thing they want to do is put you up in front of people and have you tell your story. They say you have to give your testimony. So the guy who was mentoring me in my faith said, okay, you become a Christian, you've got to tell that story to people. And he had me in front of all kinds of groups, high school groups early in the morning. I did a funeral one time. I didn't know anybody there. It's just like, hey, I know the guy died. Let me tell you how he came to Christ. It was just kind of odd. But I will say, my wife's sister came to faith at a funeral. So, those are times when we're asking big questions. But the guy who was setting me up to do this, his name was Michael, he knew a principle of amateur public speaking, and that is, it's really hard to get up and speak in front of people, but the only thing that's harder than that is, once you get up and start talking, to stop. Have you ever had that situation where, someone gets up who's an amateur and it's like, I know you can't stop talking, but let your mouth just stop and it'll be okay. I remember when I was with Fellowship of Christian Athletes at Clarion University, we used to have these athlete breakfasts, and we had brought in Coach Bub. Some of you may remember him. He was a legendary wrestling coach, and he was the guest speaker, and we had a girl come up and give her testimony. Well, she went on for 45 minutes for like a 3-minute testimony. He got up and he was so kind and said, well, our sister's pretty much taken all our time. So anyway, the hardest thing to do is to get up. The second hardest thing is to shut up when you're done. So he said, have a passage in mind that you can close with. That was a trick. And so I chose this passage, and it's the one we're going to be looking at today. And it goes like this. Let's read it together. We know that we have come to know him if we obey his commands. The man who says, I know him, but does not do what he commands is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But if anyone obeys his word, God's love is truly made complete in him. This is how we know that we are in him. Whoever claims to live in him must walk as Jesus did. Now, there's a lot in this passage to shape a life, and I'd like to look at 3 things we find in it, and they are these 3 things. First of all, there is a test, and then there's a promise, and then there is a command. And the command kind of is a little redundant. We'll spend most of our time on the first 2. So here's the test. We know that we have come to know him if we obey his commands. Now, don't you think at some point in every life, people will ask the question, I wonder if I'm going to heaven when I die. Even if they're not sure about heaven, they'll say, I wonder what's going to happen to me when I die. And for a lot of people, in more Christian circles, they say, am I a Christian? Now, you'll notice here that John puts the question in a different way. He says, here's how you know, not if you're going to heaven or if you are a Christian. He says, here's how you know if you, what? Know him. So his language is around knowing him. Now, I'm just going to ask you the question, do you know him? You might say, Well, I think I do. The nice thing is John here gives you a test. He's giving you a literal test you can ask yourself. We know that we have come to know him, or you know you've come to know him if you obey his commands. Now, you might say, Mark, I've heard you preach over the years. You don't believe in works salvation. This sounds like the kind of thing where you get in by what you do. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. Now, listen to this, because there's a very superficial way that people tend to think of God. And it's something like this. You have to jump through certain hoops to get to heaven. Or they might say, what do I need to kind of pass the test? And I think most people in the world think like that. I mean, don't you? They think, kind of, what do I have to do? I remember I had a New Testament professor. He was a wonderful guy. His name was Dr. Gordon Fee. And he said, I sometimes get the question, what do I have to do to get into heaven? Or at its worst, I get the question, what's the least I have to do to get into heaven when I die? He would get that question. And he said, I always wanted to answer it by saying, well, you just need to stop asking that stupid question, get saved. Because Christians would never ask the question that way. But most people view God transactionally. What do I need to do to get him to do what I want him to do, right? Now, there's actually a name for that. That's a magical view of God. It's like, what do I have to do to kind of rub the lamp of God to get him to do what I want to do, to heal me or bless me or prosper me? That's really a very normal way of viewing God. And frankly, it creeps into all of our Christian lives. We all have a little bit of it. But the Bible has a very different way of portraying God. God wants us, he wants us to know him. That means he wants us to know his character. He wants us to see all the things about him, his goodness, his generosity, his patience with us, his mercy, his grace, his purity, his holiness, his justice, his infiniteness, his perfection, his love. He wants us to see that he doesn't change. He doesn't get new information and have to come up with a change of his plans. He doesn't learn. Everything is conditioned by his love. He knows everything. He's everywhere. He's in control. Even when things seem out of control, he's still sovereignly working in our lives and in the world to accomplish his will. He wants us to know him because he knows that once we know him and see him as he is, we will fall in love with him. We will be attracted to him. There's this odd phrase in Scripture where it talks about the beauty of holiness. And it's this idea where we see God in his perfection and we're both put off a little bit because we're like, gosh, he's awesome, but we're also attracted to him. We're attracted to that mysterious quality where we say, he's so perfect and so different than me, but I want to be like him. That's the beauty of holiness, the beauty of his perfection. And as we see him as he is, what naturally happens to us is, in comparison, we see how we are. So we say, oh, I see how he is. And then we go, but wait a second, I'm not like that. I'm selfish and I'm short-tempered and, I don't have this goodness. And what that does when we see him as he is and see us as we are is we say, I need to do something about that. Even God, I can't do anything about it. Can you do something about it? He said, well, that's the whole message of Jesus. You can be forgiven because I know you want to be like me. And I think that the modern transactional concept of how we are connected to God is so pale next to John's vision. Everything a Christian does, everything we do is meant to expand our knowledge of God. When we're suffering, God, I don't understand you. You're mysterious. How can I know you better? And again, what does it say here? We know that we have come to know him if we obey his commands. Do you know him? God, because you're a perfectly loving being, I want to be perfectly loving. You're perfectly gracious and merciful. I want to be merciful. I want to be more kind. You want to become like this heroic figure that God is. When I followed Christ at age 22, Jesus Christ became my role model. It changed from any of these superficial figures to Jesus. I mean, you got the Father, you got the brother, but none of you said Jesus, so I'm going to give you an A- on that. And, you think about him, and I began to think about him at that time in my life. He was very strong. He didn't mince words. You could never trip him up. He was strong and forceful when he needed to be. He was kind and loving and understanding when he needed to be. He was always in control, even when things seemed out of control. You couldn't throw Jesus off his game, right? You could never catch him up on anything. And through all that, even with people who were very hard on them, he spoke truth to them, but he loved them. He saw through them, he saw into them, and he loved them. But, his claims were so strong and absolute. He said, hey, so I want to follow you. Say, let the dead bury their dead. Just come and follow me. Who says that? Leave your nets. Stop fishing and come, I'll make you a fisherman. Leave your small dreams behind and follow me. Audacious things to say. But when we come to follow Jesus, as this passage says, he becomes our role model. He becomes the model of what we want to be in our lives. And you see that all over John's epistle. Take a look at this passage. It's a little later in the book. It's chapter 4 of 1 John. It says, in this way, and look at the language is exactly the same, love is made complete among us so that we will have confidence on the day of judgment, because in this world, we're like him. We emulate him. We copy him. There's that test. We will have confidence in the day of judgment because we say, well, I live like you. I was like you. Sometimes when people ask these questions about themselves and their destiny and their connection to God, they'll say something like, well, I prayed a prayer when I was in high school. Or they'll talk about some other religious action from the past. I was catechized, or whatever they would say, baptized. And John says the test of whether you have come to know him is your life passion to live like him. But today I find people want the blessings of God without obedience to God. Do you see that? They want the blessings of God, but they don't want to hear about obedience to God. And I don't think God offers his blessings that way. So now let's turn to the second part. And this is the part that really captured me. It's the promise. If you'd put that up there, the promise. But if anyone obeys his word, and we saw it in the passage I just read as a second chance for that. If anyone obeys his word, God's love is truly made complete in him. Now, up until the time I was confronted by Jesus, I was mostly like every other 22-year-old. When you're 22, what's your life like? I was selfish. I wanted to fit in. That was very important. I wanted girls to like me and guys to at least respect me. I wanted to be cool and popular. And I don't know that it's that much different now than it was then. Back then, we were all selfish. We just hadn't institutionalized it as a way to live like we have today. Do you hear me? Because back then, we didn't have a way to take endless photos of ourselves and publish them for public consumption. So we have basically institutionalized narcissism. And we've made it something that is just de rigueur. It's the thing you do. I could tell you stories, and we can all, it's kind of, pointless. But, when I'm at the beach sometimes, I swim at the beach. Like I train like I swim. And actually ran into a manatee swimming one day. That was real funny and a little scary. No sharks, but just a manatee. But the other day I was swimming, and here's two girls in the water. They had their phones in the water with them. They even take their phones in the water and were filming themselves. And then we were out on Singer Island the other day, and there was this guy, he was snorkeling, and his girlfriend was just, filming herself. We have institutionalized through our media narcissism, and I don't think it's doing any good for anybody. But I just didn't have those techniques, but I was still totally self-absorbed, because you all are at 22, right? Aren't we all? We all are. At 22, so that was right at 22 when I was having this conversion, this passage gave me a new vision for life. What caught me was that God could make his love perfect in me if I would obey him. That his love could be perfected in me. Isn't that a compelling vision? That God could make his love perfect in you if you would obey him? And I wanted the perfect love of God to shape my life. So I set out on a mission to figure out how to do that. And I distinctly remember my thought, God, you won't fail with me because I don't give you everything. Take my life and make it something that manifests your love in the way you want it to. And 44 years later, I'm still bearing the marks of that decision. When I meet a stranger, when I get to know my neighbors in Florida, when I wonder how to treat my wife when we get sideways with each other, when I try to treat my daughters, with care, when I deal with my son-in-law, I am primarily animated by the urge to love them the way Jesus would love them. That's what we are to be. And when I meet people I disagree with, how that is so prevalent today, I think, well, first, love them. And I don't do it right all the time. It's like this journey of the Christian life is learning to love like Jesus. But, Doug, you have a particular challenge to being a loving person. There's something in your personality. And Doug, I'm going to call it every Doug in the room. Doug, you have one too. And Bev, there are particular things in each of us that makes it hard to love. And, every one of us has these things that make it hard for us to be loving. And God says, well, that's what I want to work with you on. I want to teach you that. And your whole life is this process of minimizing those weaknesses that make you unloving and maximizing the parts of you that make you loving. There's a parallel promise in John 7, and I want to put it up here for you. Jesus stood up and called out in a loud voice, "If anyone is thirsty, let them come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, streams of living water will flow from within him." He was speaking about the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were later to receive. So this promise that God's Spirit, his Spirit, which is a spirit of love, can come out of you, that's for you and that's for me. He will make his love perfect in you. His Spirit will flow out of you when you meet people. Some of you know, my wife is on Facebook, and I told you last time that we were going to be taking a trip to Africa. On my wife's, on her, everybody has a bucket list, right? You have a bucket list. When I met Gina, she said, and we started dating, she said, "I'll date you, but I want you to know I'm going to be a missionary in Africa, and if we are going to go anywhere in this relationship, you have to be okay with that." And I said, "Okay, I'm in. We'll be missionaries to Africa." And for a while, that was our trajectory. And so that's when she was, 21 years old. And so that never happened. God took us in a different direction. But all her life, she's wanted to go to Africa. So we finally got to do that in a dream trip, and we went on a safari in Zimbabwe. Now, we had a phenomenal trip. Some of you said, "I'm jealous," or "want to hear about it." It was a wonderful trip. But here's one of the things about safari. When you're on a safari, unless you pay the extra money, there's other people in your vehicle. The vehicle seats 8 people, a driver, someone here, and then 3 rows of 2. And so you get mixed in with some strangers. That can be good, and it can also be not that good. And so the first group we were mixed in, it wasn't that good. And so we were with this group of people, and the first thing they did was they kind of sat in places where it separated us. And my wife's like, "I want to sit with my husband." And so, we kind of got it straightened out. But these people, it wasn't just that. They were really kind of rude, like cut in front of Gina, waiting for the bathroom one day. She helped him on with his coat, didn't say anything. And I don't want to stereotype or identify what country they're from, but when I said bonjour, they didn't even say anything. But after a few days, they left, and we got this other couple who were then mixed in with us, and they were from L.A. And when I say they were from L.A., I mean you didn't have to have them tell you they were from L.A. People from L.A. have a look. And they had the look, they had the careers. She was a lawyer and a law school professor, I think working in human trafficking, actually. And he was a former movie producer and fashion photographer. He had long gray hair, looked very hip and very L.A. And as the time went on, we really enjoyed each other. The other couple with us, we had a nice rapport. It just changed the whole thing because the other people had been a total buzzkill, and these guys were great. So we were having a great time. And so. But at some point, it leaked out that I was a pastor, and I could tell that their L.A. life, didn't include any pastors. That wasn't in their wheelhouse. And so, but again, there was kindness being exchanged. We actually left them a pair of binoculars because they were going to go out on a solo safari for 10 days in like a vehicle. And they said, "Oh, we forgot our binoculars." I said, "Take ours." So we had a nice rapport. As a matter of fact, at the end, they said, "Let's take pictures with you because you're the first guys we wanted to take pictures with." I was like, "That's a score." The last night of the last safari, we were on this water hole coming back to our camp. And I don't know if you've ever been in a part of the world. I'm sure it's not unique to Africa, but when you look up at the stars, it's a different sky. Have you ever been in a place like that where it's like here you see stars, but there it's like, oh my gosh, there's like 1,000,000 more stars than I've ever seen. It's like they're everywhere. We could even see, and you've probably seen this, the Milky Way. You see that cloudy Milky Way. And we're just sitting there in the silence. And, we're with our friends who actually used to go to this church and now live in Orlando, and then my L.A. couple friends. And we're looking up at it, and a passage of Scripture came to mind to me. And I thought, should I share this? And you know that moment, right? You know, the moment of, I don't want to, push myself on people, but I thought, Lord, I'm just going to share this. And I remembered it by the grace of God. I'm going to read it so I get it right here. I said this. I said, the Old Testament book of Psalms records someone's reaction to a moment just like this. When I look at the heavens, the work of your hands, the moon and the stars which you've set in place, what is man that you're mindful of him? The Son of Man that you care for him. And I said, humanity's always been dwarfed by the grandeur of the heavens. That's all I said. Nobody said a word. Actually, our friend said thank you. Nobody said a word. The next morning, because they were leaving that morning, before we parted ways, and after we'd taken those pictures together, the woman from L.A. came up to me and she said, what's the name of your church? Because she said, my mom lives in Florida, and I'd like to hook her up with you. She also said that. She's in one of those evangelical churches. I didn't say anything. But I tell that story because, to me, that's what happens when you're letting the love of God flow out to you, to people, and the part of you that loves God connects with the part of them that wants to love God. The part of them that God put in them that's shaped to love him, and they realize, like, not everybody who loves God is weird. A lot of us are. Yeah, most of us are, but not in that bad ways. And to me, that just felt like what God loves to do. This whole epistle of John tells us that people who are filled with him naturally are overflowing vessels of love. Let me read to you 1 John 4:7 through 12. This kind of goes there. Dear friends, let us love one another. Again, this is later in the epistle. Because love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever doesn't love doesn't know God. Because God is love. Now here's how God showed his love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. This is love, not that we love God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. Dear friends, since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God. But if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is made complete in us. There's that phrase again, the perfecting of his love. So God promises that if you seek him, his will and his ways, you obey his word, you live by the boundaries, young people, of his life, that he is going to manifest his love through you in powerful ways. Now, I said there was a test, a promise, and a command. Let's look at the last. It's the command, and the command is whoever claims to live in him must walk as Jesus did. I'm just going to touch on this one because it's a bit redundant. Many of you are too young or too maybe new to Christianity to remember a book that was written quite a few years ago, but it's remained popular. How many of you are familiar with the book In His Steps by Charles Sheldon? Okay, not that many of you. It was written in 1896. You'll be familiar with the phrase of the subtitle. It was called In His Steps, What Would Jesus Do? And so it's the book, and it's this novel, this creation of a town where people decide to ask the question, what would Jesus do? And the whole town is transformed by that. I tell you that because when you walk with Jesus, you're compelled to live as he did. It's not optional. It's not for 401 followers. If you're going to claim to live in him, you have to set about walking the way he did. Now, let me just come back for a moment before I close up to the dads in the room. If you listen to the static of the world these days, you know that one of the big conversations out there is about power disparities, right? It's about power disparities. It's all about, we hear this language of, it's all about oppressors and the oppressed. You know what I'm talking about? It's a very big topic in our world. And it seems that in this worldview, power is always a bad thing because it's always used by the oppressor against the oppressed. But listen carefully here. A father is a man who uses all the power at his command to bless his family. A father uses power to bless his children. A father, a godly father, uses his power in the world to make the world a better place. And men, we shouldn't be ashamed of the power of masculinity as we bring it to bear on our wives, on our children, in our jobs, in our culture. Don't listen to what the culture is saying about all power being bad, because in point of fact, who was the most powerful man alive? And this is the right answer. It's the standard one. Go ahead, give it to me. Jesus was the most powerful man alive. And he could have used the power. I could call down all the legions of heaven. He could do anything he wanted. He could know anything, but he subjugated that power. Why? For the good of others. So the ultimate man was the ultimate power person, and he was what was called meek, which is not weak. It's power kept into control for the good of others. And so dads, that's what we are. And what a calling it is. So if someone says, no, power's bad, I say, the most powerful man in the world figured out how to use power for good, and that's what I want to be. He's my hero. That's what I want to be like. Let me just close with that passage again. We know that we have come to know him if we obey his commands. There's the test. And I know this is in the old language, but I wanted the NIV 1984 for this. The man who says, I know him. It could be a woman who says, I know him, but does not do what he commands. That person's a liar, and the truth is not in him. But if anyone obeys his word, God's love is truly made complete in him, or perfected in him or her. This is how we know that we are in him. Whoever claims to live in him must walk as Jesus did. Jesus once told a story that probably, if you're a Christian, if you read the Bible, this is one of those top 3 that get under your skin. And it's the story in Matthew 25 where Jesus is talking about the judgment. And here's what he says in the first part of it. He says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on a glorious throne. So this is that testing time, right? This is the testing moment. And he says, before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people from one another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. And you're thinking, that's the group you want to be in, right? That's the word you want to hear. And then here was the test. Because I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me a drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. Now, what are all those things? It's being loving. You were loving. So I know you're in me because you lived like I did. That's how I lived. You lived like me. But then the righteous will answer and say, wait a second, Lord, when did we see you hungry? I don't remember that. And feed you. I don't remember seeing you thirsty and giving you a drink. I can't remember that. I don't remember seeing you as a stranger and welcomed you. I don't remember you being naked and clothing you. And when did we see you sick and in prison and visit you? I don't remember. And the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it for one of the least of my brothers, you did it to me. You can see where John got this teaching from. He's saying, I'm going to judge because I'm going to say, did you live like me? Did you love like me? My first ministry position was up in Clarion, First Baptist Church. And if you know Clarion, you know where the McDonald's is on Main Street there. And so our church was right next door to there. And we were on what was called the Hobo Highway, which is the way that hobos or homeless people make it across the state. And so Clarion was one of the stops. They'd come in, they'd look for food and gas sometimes if they were driving, that kind of thing. It was the Hobo Highway. And our church was always one of those ones hit. And so this guy comes in one day. I was in the secretary's office, and he says, it was a cold winter day, and he said, could I get a hat? Kind of cold out there. An old, gentleman. And I remember thinking, because we get hit a lot, we don't have any hats. He's like, okay, thanks very much. And, didn't make anything out of it and started walking out behind the McDonald's. Like, I'm watching out the window, of the secretary's window, and this guy's walking with quite a bit of dignity, tall guy walking down that alley. And in my mind, I go, Jesus, I am not letting you leave here without a hat. So I went out and I called him and said, hey, come on back. And I don't remember that I was that warm and fuzzy, but I said, come on, get back here, come on back. I live right here. I live right behind there in a house on Liberty Street, 700 Liberty. And I said, just give me a second. I went over and I just found the first wool hat I could find. I gave it to him. I said, I want you to have this hat. And he said, thank you, and he walked away. And what Jesus is saying is, that wasn't me like me, but I was meeting you by being him, and you responded the right way. You responded by taking care of the me that was in that guy. Do you know him? You know, is your life modeled after his? You know, this is an old student ministry illustration. You know what this is a cup of water. You know why if I knock it, water comes out? You know why water comes out? Because water's in it. What comes out of you when someone knocks you? Love? Because whatever's in you is going to come out. And I have to admit, when I thought about that, I thought, recently, I'm not sure I've been pouring out water on everybody who knocks me. A little more aggression, maybe. And I think, Lord, help me to live and love like your Son, Jesus Christ.